What if the attacks in your life aren't random and you've been ignoring the very words that can stop them instantly? These seven Psalms carry power most people never unlock. Once you understand and speak them with authority, everything shifts, fear breaks, confusion clears, and unseen battles turn in your favor. I need you to listen carefully, not casually, because what I'm about to share is not theory, it's not imagination, it's not something I read in a book. This is something I experienced from the other side. There are things people don't understand about spiritual attacks. Many think it's just bad luck, delay, confusion, sudden fear, strange dreams, or things not working out. But there are forces behind patterns, and those forces respond to authority. Not noise, not empty words, but authority. There were moments when I saw how certain words, especially from scripture, carried a kind of weight that disrupted operations instantly, not gradually, not after hours, but immediately. And among all the scriptures, the Psalms were the ones we feared the most when they were spoken with understanding. Not memorized, not repeated mechanically, but spoken like a weapon. The first one you must understand is Psalm 23. People think it's just comforting words for funerals or peaceful moments, but that's not how it works in the Spirit. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. That statement alone establishes ownership. It declares that you are not abandoned, you are not exposed. When someone truly understands that, fear loses access. And where fear cannot enter, manipulation becomes difficult. When it says, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, it's not poetry, it's a legal declaration. Fear is permission. When fear is denied, certain attacks lose their legal ground. There were times operations depended on planting fear through dreams, through sudden anxiety, through negative thoughts. But when someone stood firm in that psalm, not just quoting it but believing it, it became like a shield that could not be penetrated easily. It wasn't about loudness, it was about conviction. Then there is Psalm 27. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? That question is not rhetorical in the spirit realm. It is a challenge. It confronts anything trying to introduce intimidation. The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When this is spoken with understanding, it disrupts cycles of oppression because many attacks are built on weakening your inner strength first. If your strength collapses, everything else follows. There were instances where individuals under pressure suddenly became stable, not because the situation changed, but because something inside them aligned with that truth. And when that happens, it's like losing grip on them. When the wicked, even mine enemies and my foes, came upon me to eat up my flesh, they stumbled and fell. That's not symbolic, it describes reversal, plans backfiring, strategies collapsing. But it only manifests when the person speaking it stands in authority, not doubt. Psalm 35 is another one that was extremely disruptive. Plead my cause, O Lord, with them that strive with me. Fight against them that fight against me. This is dangerous territory for any force operating against someone, because now the battle is no longer one sided, it shifts responsibility. When someone invokes divine intervention like that with clarity, it's no longer a human resisting, it becomes something greater stepping in. Take hold of shield and buckler and stand up for mine help. That imagery is not decorative, it activates defense. There were patterns where attacks would escalate, but when this psalm was engaged, it created resistance that was difficult to bypass, especially the part that says, let them be confounded and put to shame that seek after my soul. Confusion is a powerful disruptor. When operations become confused, they collapse from within. Then there is Psalm 91. This one is widely known, but rarely understood deeply. He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. That word dwelleth is key. It's not about visiting occasionally, it's about consistency. Because protection is not random, it is sustained by alignment. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress. That is declaration, that is positioning. When someone truly stands in that place, certain attacks don't just fail, they don't even reach. Surely he shall deliver thee from the snare of the fowler. that speaks of hidden traps, unseen setups. There were many strategies designed to trap people through circumstances, relationships, decisions. But this psalm, when engaged properly, exposed and dismantled those traps. 1,000 shall fall at thy side, and 10,000 at thy right hand, but it shall not come nigh thee. That is separation. It means things can be happening around you, but not affecting you. That level of immunity is not normal, it is established. Psalm 70 is short but very aggressive. Let God arise, let his enemies be scattered. That line alone carries force because it shifts the atmosphere. When that is declared with intensity, it disrupts arrangements. It forces movement. Let them be turned back and put to confusion. That desire my hurt. Again, confusion. Because confusion breaks coordination. And when coordination is broken, attacks lose effectiveness. There were times when quick intervention was needed, and long prayers were not possible. This psalm was like a rapid response. It didn't require length, it required precision and belief. Psalm 121 is another one that establishes awareness. I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. That statement alone redirects focus, because many people are overwhelmed by what they see around them. But this shifts vision upward. My help cometh from the Lord. That's alignment again. He will not suffer thy foot to be moved. Stability. That's critical, because many attacks aim to destabilize emotionally, mentally, spiritually. Once instability is achieved, everything else becomes easier. But this psalm reinforces grounding. The Lord shall preserve thee from all evil. That's comprehensive, not selective, not partial, all. He shall preserve thy soul. That's deeper than physical protection. That's internal protection. Because if your soul is intact, manipulation becomes difficult. And then Psalm 144. This one is powerful in a different way. Blessed be the Lord my strength, which teacheth my hands to war and my fingers to fight. That's training, that's empowerment. It means you are not passive, you are equipped. My goodness and my fortress, my high tower and my deliverer, that establishes layers of defense, not just one level, but multiple. Rid me and deliver me from the hand of strange children, whose mouth speaketh vanity, and their right hand is a right hand of falsehood, that addresses deception. Because not all attacks are direct. Some come through lies, through manipulation, through false appearances. There were systems built on deception, on presenting one thing while hiding another. But when this psalm is engaged, it exposes that. It breaks illusions. What you must understand is this: these psalms are not magic formulas, they are not charms, they are not effective because they are repeated. They are effective because of the authority behind them and the understanding of the one speaking them. There were many who spoke these words casually, and nothing happened. But there were some who spoke them with conviction, with alignment, with clarity, and it was like a force was released. Not gradually, not slowly, but instantly. Spiritual attacks depend on access, permission, and weakness. These psalms, when engaged properly, remove those elements. They close doors, they strengthen the inner man, they establish authority. And once authority is established, everything changes because it's no longer about reacting to attacks. It's about standing in a position where attacks struggle to even begin. You don't need to shout, you don't need to perform. What matters is understanding and alignment. Because when those two are present, even a quiet declaration can shake things you cannot see. There are things that operate in darkness, in secrecy, in silence. But these words carry light. And light doesn't negotiate with darkness, it removes it. So when you speak, don't speak casually. Don't speak as if you're hoping something might happen. Speak knowing, speak standing, speak aligned. Because that's what makes the difference between words and power. And there is something else most people overlook. Something that determined whether those words carried weight or remained empty. It was not just what was spoken, it was the state of the person speaking. Because in the realm where these things operate, consistency matters more than intensity. You can shout for one moment and be silent in your lifestyle, and it weakens everything. But when a person becomes steady, when their mind, their focus, Their belief begins to align daily, then even a whisper becomes heavy. There were moments when strategies were built around distraction, not direct attack, but subtle interference, delaying people, keeping them busy, draining their attention with unnecessary things, because a distracted mind rarely stands in authority, and once attention is scattered, it becomes easier to introduce confusion, to plant thoughts that don't belong, to shift direction slowly without the person even realizing it. But when someone begins to engage with intention, especially with these Psalms, it starts pulling their focus back. It stabilizes their awareness. And that alone disrupts many hidden operations. You have to understand, not every attack looks aggressive. Some come as weariness, unexplained heaviness, lack of motivation, or sudden loss of clarity. Things you cannot explain logically, and if you don't recognize it, you will treat it as normal. But when someone begins to speak words like those in Psalm 23 or Psalm 27 with awareness, it starts to push back against that weight. It's like something lifts internally, and once that lifting begins, clarity returns and decisions become sharper. There were times when people were targeted not because of where they were, but because of where they were going. Potential attracts attention, destiny attracts resistance, and many never reach certain levels, not because they lack ability, but because they were weakened along the way. Slowly, gradually, through repeated pressure, until they gave up or settled. But these Psalms, when used with understanding, interrupt that process. They restore strength before collapse happens. Another thing you must know is that timing matters. There were certain hours when activities intensified. Late at night, early morning, moments when the environment is quiet and the mind is more open. That's when suggestions are planted, when dreams are influenced, when fear tries to enter subtly. But those who were consistent with these words created a barrier that extended even into those moments. It wasn't about reacting after something happened, it was about establishing protection beforehand. And when someone reaches that level, something changes. They stop being a target that is easily influenced. It becomes difficult to insert fear, difficult to create confusion, difficult to sustain pressure, because their internal state resists it. Their thoughts become guarded, their emotions become stable. And once that happens, many operations lose effectiveness. You may not see anything with your eyes, but there are reactions that happen instantly. There were times when a person would begin to declare Psalm 91 with full conviction, and it was like a boundary was drawn around them, not visible physically, but real. Attempts to penetrate that boundary would fail, not because the attack was weak, but because the defense was established properly. And it's important to say this clearly: repetition without understanding does not produce results. Many repeat words, hoping something will happen. But hope without alignment creates frustration. The power is not in how many times you say it, it's in how deeply you stand in it. One clear, aligned declaration carries more weight than 100 empty repetitions. There were also moments when attacks were layered, not just one issue, but multiple things happening at once: financial pressure, emotional stress, relationship strain, all at the same time. This was intentional, because when everything hits at once, it overwhelms the mind. And once overwhelmed, a person becomes easier to control, easier to misdirect. But those who understood how to stand in these Psalms did not collapse under that pressure. Instead, they became steady even in chaos. Psalm 35, for example, when spoken with clarity in such moments, did more than defend. It pushed back. It shifted the direction of events. Things that were arranged began to fall apart. Plans that were set in motion started to fail. And from the outside, it looked like coincidence. But it was not. There is also the matter of voice. Not volume, but intention. Because words spoken without intention are just sounds. But words spoken with focus carry direction. There were people who whispered these psalms, and yet the effect was stronger than those who shouted with understanding. Because intention sharpens the word, it gives it direction, it gives it force. And then there is persistence. Not repeating the same thing endlessly, but maintaining alignment over time. Because some resistances don't break instantly, not because the words are weak, but because the person has been under pressure for a long time and layers have formed. But consistent alignment begins to break those layers one by one. Slowly at first, then more rapidly. There were cases where someone felt nothing at the beginning, no change, no shift, nothing, and many stop at that point. They assume it's not working. But what they don't realize is that sometimes the first thing that happens is internal adjustment. Their thinking begins to change, their perception begins to shift. And once that foundation is corrected, external changes follow. You must also understand the role of belief, not blind belief, but convinced understanding, because doubt creates openings. It weakens the declaration, it introduces instability. And instability is what many attacks rely on. But when belief becomes firm, when there is no hesitation, it closes those openings. There were moments when everything depended on whether a person would hold their ground or give in to fear, because fear opens doors quickly. It invites more pressure, it signals weakness. But when someone stands firm, even if they feel pressure but refuse to yield internally, it disrupts the entire operation. Psalm 70, being short, was often underestimated, but its force came from urgency. It didn't waste time, it didn't explain, it commanded. And in situations where time was critical, that kind of directness made a difference. It forced immediate reaction. It created movement where there was stagnation. Psalm 121 brought stability when everything else was shaking. It reminded the person where their help comes from, and that alone corrected many internal imbalances. Because when a person looks in the wrong direction for help, they become vulnerable. But when their focus is correct, their position becomes stronger. Psalm 144, on the other hand, built readiness. It prepared the person not just to resist, but to engage with awareness. It shifted them from being passive to being active, and that change alone altered outcomes, because passivity allows things to happen, but awareness introduces resistance. And there is something that cannot be ignored. These words do not work in isolation from your daily life. If everything else contradicts what you are saying, it creates conflict, and conflict weakens the effect. But when your actions, your thoughts, your focus begin to align with what you declare, it strengthens everything. There were individuals who made small adjustments, not dramatic changes, but consistent ones. They became more aware of their thoughts, more careful with their words, more intentional with their focus. And over time, the difference became clear. Things that used to affect them no longer had the same impact. Situations that once overwhelmed them became manageable. And slowly, what once felt like constant attack began to reduce, not because everything disappeared, but because their position changed. They were no longer easily shaken. They were no longer easily influenced. They became steady. You have to realize authority is not given randomly, it is recognized. And when it is recognized, it changes how things respond to you. These Psalms, when understood and engaged properly, help establish that recognition. So when you speak, don't rush through it, don't treat it as routine. Take a moment to understand what you are saying. Let it settle in your mind. Let it become real to you. Because once it becomes real internally, it begins to manifest externally. And when that happens, you will notice the difference, not always in dramatic ways, but in subtle shifts. Peace where there was anxiety, clarity where there was confusion, strength where there was weakness. And those subtle shifts are what change everything over time. And as you continue to engage with these words, something deeper begins to happen that most people cannot explain at first. It's not just about resisting pressure anymore, it becomes about awareness. You begin to notice patterns you never saw before. Situations that used to confuse you suddenly become clear. You start recognizing when something is trying to influence your thoughts, when something is trying to push you into fear or frustration without reason. That awareness alone becomes a powerful form of protection because what is exposed loses much of its strength. There were many situations where the greatest advantage came from people not knowing what was happening to them. Confusion is a powerful tool. When a person cannot identify the source of what they are feeling, they become reactive. They make decisions based on emotion, based on pressure, based on incomplete understanding. And those decisions often lead them deeper into difficulty. But once awareness is activated, once clarity begins to take hold, that cycle breaks. You begin to pause before reacting. You begin to question sudden emotions. You begin to separate what is truly yours from what is being introduced. And in that moment of separation, control returns to you. That is something many people never experience. And that is why they remain in cycles they cannot explain. There were also instances where pressure was applied gradually, not all at once. A small problem here, a delay there, a misunderstanding somewhere else. Nothing too overwhelming individually, but together it created a constant sense of frustration. Over time, that frustration would weaken the person, making them more susceptible to discouragement. And once discouragement sets in, it becomes easier to introduce thoughts of giving up, settling, or stepping back from what they were meant to pursue. But when someone begins to stand in the authority of these Psalms, that gradual pressure begins to lose its effect. Not because the small issues disappear immediately, but because the person is no longer reacting the same way. They remain steady, they remain focused, and because of that, the intended outcome, discouragement, never fully takes hold. There is also the matter of consistency across different areas of life. It is not enough to stand firm in one moment and then lose focus in another, because pressure often shifts. If it cannot affect you in one area, it will attempt to move to another. If fear doesn't work, it may try distraction. If distraction doesn't work, it may try weariness. It adapts. And that is why consistency is so important. Those who maintained alignment across different situations became increasingly difficult to influence. It wasn't that they were perfect, but they were aware, and that awareness allowed them to correct themselves quickly. They didn't stay in confusion for long. They didn't remain in fear once they recognized it. They adjusted, and that adjustment kept them stable. Another thing that became clear over time is the importance of internal agreement, because it is possible to say one thing outwardly and believe something else inwardly, and that contradiction weakens everything. There were moments when someone would declare words of strength, but internally they were expecting failure, and that expectation created a gap. It reduced the effectiveness of what they were saying. But when someone reaches a point where their inner belief matches their outward declaration, something shifts. The words carry more weight. They become aligned. And alignment produces strength. It removes internal conflict. And without that conflict, resistance becomes stronger. There were also cases where the environment played a role, not in the sense that it controlled everything, but in how it influenced the mind. Surroundings filled with negativity, constant noise, or distraction made it harder to maintain focus. And when focus is broken repeatedly, it becomes harder to stand in authority consistently. But those who learned to create moments of stillness, even briefly, found it easier to reconnect, to realign, and to speak with clarity. Silence in those moments was not emptiness, it was preparation. It allowed thoughts to settle, it allowed understanding to deepen. And when words were spoken from that place, they carried more precision. There were times when resistance appeared stronger than usual, moments when it seemed like nothing was changing despite continued effort. And those were critical points, because many would stop there. They would assume that it was not working, that it was ineffective. But what was actually happening in many of those situations was that deeper layers were being addressed. Not everything breaks at the surface level. Some patterns are rooted deeper, built over time through repeated experiences, repeated thoughts, repeated reactions, and breaking those patterns requires persistence. It requires staying aligned, even when results are not immediately visible. Those who continued, despite not seeing immediate change, often experience sudden shifts later. Things that seemed stuck would suddenly move. Situations that were delayed would suddenly resolve, and it would appear unexpected, but it was not. It was the result of sustained alignment, reaching a point where the resistance could no longer hold. You also need to understand that not every thought that enters your mind belongs to you. This is something many people struggle with. They assume that everything they think is a reflection of who they are. But there were clear moments where thoughts were introduced, fearful thoughts, negative expectations, sudden doubts that did not originate from the person themselves. And if those thoughts are accepted without question, they begin to shape behavior. They influence decisions. They create unnecessary fear. But when someone becomes aware of this, when they begin to question and reject what does not align, it breaks that influence. The Psalms, when spoken with understanding, help reinforce that separation. They strengthen the mind. They provide a reference point. They remind the person of what is true, even when other thoughts try to suggest otherwise. There were also instances where people underestimated the impact of small compromises, not major decisions, but small ones, allowing certain thoughts to remain, engaging in certain patterns that slowly weakened their focus, ignoring moments where they should have stood firm. And over time, those small compromises created openings. But the opposite was also true. Small acts of consistency, small moments of choosing alignment over distraction, choosing clarity over confusion, choosing steadiness over reaction. Those small decisions built strength over time. It didn't happen instantly, but it accumulated. And eventually, the person became stronger than the pressure they were facing. You have to recognize that authority grows with use. The more you stand in it, the more natural it becomes. At first, it may feel unfamiliar. It may feel like effort. But over time, it becomes your default position. And when it becomes your default, you no longer wait for pressure to respond. You remain steady regardless of what is happening around you. There were individuals who reached that point where their stability was not dependent on circumstances. Things could change around them, situations could shift, but internally they remained grounded. And because of that, they were not easily moved. That kind of stability changes everything. It affects how you think, how you respond, how you make decisions. It removes impulsiveness. It replaces reaction with intention. And when intention guides your actions, you begin to move differently. You make choices based on clarity, not pressure. You remain focused even when distractions are present. This is where the real transformation happens, not just in resisting what is negative, but in strengthening what is within you. Because once your inner state is strong, external influences lose much of their power. They may still exist, but they no longer control you. And that is the difference between someone who is constantly reacting and someone who is standing in authority. One is moved by circumstances, the other remains steady regardless of them. And as you continue to engage with these words, not casually, not mechanically, but with understanding and alignment, that steadiness begins to grow. It becomes part of how you think, part of how you respond, part of how you move through situations. And once it reaches that point, it is no longer something you do occasionally. It becomes who you are. What you have heard is not just a collection of words, but a shift in understanding. The difference between people who remain under constant pressure and those who rise above it is not luck, and it is not chance. It comes down to awareness, alignment, and authority. These psalms are not ordinary passages meant to be recited without thought. They are declarations that, when understood and spoken with conviction, begin to change the internal state of a person first, and then influence everything around them. The real battle is not always what you see. It often begins in the mind, through fear, confusion, distraction, and discouragement. If those elements are allowed to take root, they slowly weaken a person from within. But when you begin to engage with these words properly, they interrupt that process. They restore clarity where there was confusion, strength where there was weakness, and peace where there was anxiety. And once that internal shift happens, external situations begin to lose their control over you. you must understand that consistency is key. It is not about one moment of intensity, but about building a steady position over time. When your thoughts, your focus, and your declarations begin to align, something changes. You stop reacting to everything around you, and instead, you begin to stand firm regardless of what is happening. That stability becomes your defense, it becomes your advantage. These Psalms work not because they are repeated endlessly, but because they are understood deeply. One aligned declaration carries more weight than many empty ones. When belief and words come together, they create force, and that force is what disrupts patterns, breaks cycles, and prevents pressure from taking hold. As you apply these truths, you will begin to notice changes, sometimes subtle at first. You will recognize patterns more clearly. You will respond with intention instead of reaction. You will feel a growing sense of control over your thoughts and emotions. And over time, that control turns into authority. This is where the real transformation happens. You are no longer easily shaken. You are no longer easily influenced. You become steady, grounded, and aware. And from that position, many things that once affected you will begin to lose their power. So, this is not just about speaking words, it is about becoming aligned with what those words represent. It is about standing in a position where fear has no place, confusion cannot remain, and pressure cannot dominate. When you reach that point, everything begins to shift, not just around you, but within you. And that is where lasting change truly begins.